good. All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's study session. Ms. Donner, let's call this meeting to order at 4:30 p.m. All right, Ms. Ewan, would you mind leading us in our opening exercises, please? Thank you. All right, welcome again. Yeah, looking forward to these discussions this evening. Some subjects that I believe we're all been excited to talk more about and see where us as a board can be helpful and be a solution and support the district as it continues to move forward. So that said, we will move on to Section 3, discussion items 3.1. Academic achievement data. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that Dr. Sorensen is here with us via the phone. So you'll hear him from the ceiling this evening. All right. Mr. Merlino, anything that you'd like to say to kick us off, or shall we?
No, sir. I would just say that the first item is one that we have been putting a lot of attention and time into over the last year, and we really want to change the standard of the district providing data and information to the governing board on a continuous basis, making sure that the community knows that our focus is the achievement data. And Dr. Hernandez will walk us through that process and future expectations.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right. That said, Dr. Hernandez, you're up. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Well, good afternoon, board, cabinet, and our guest. So this afternoon, we're going to be covering accountability and achievement. Accountability is timely in that our school letter grades were released last week, and achievement plays a large role in accountability. So we'll be tag teaming the two topics together. The achievement piece will be talking about proficiency data as well as growth data. We'll examine some local data, so the assessments that we use here in the district, to illustrate how the district monitors the progress toward our student outcomes. And then we'll surface some areas of strength, some areas of concern, and then we'll look at some considerations for our performance trends. So because I have to practice what I preach as the teacher in the group, I do have a learning target for you this evening. So we always want to make sure that our learners, whether they're children or adults, know what it is we're working on learning. We know why we're learning it. And then we need to know, how do we know when we're successful with it? So I'll give you your success criteria. So we're going to unpack our state and federal accountability models, and then we're going to explore the data for what our math and English language arts performance is. Why is this important? Because we need to be able to understand our current accountability measures and achievement levels, and then how the district monitors our progress toward increasing those student outcomes. So how do you know when you've got it? So at the end of our session today, if I've done my job, you should be able to articulate the difference between accountability and achievement, and then you should be able to talk a little bit about what our trends are and what we're seeing in our data. So there will be a test at the end. You knew that was coming, didn't you, Mrs. Brooks? She got paired with me at Estancia for the walks. So I want to encourage you to ask questions along the way, because if you have a question on slide 6, the content will build upon itself. So ask that question then. I'll watch and for you to cue me. But if I don't see, just feel free to interrupt, because then when we build on later on, it could become more challenging to understand if we didn't ask that question ahead of time. But need you to keep me honest. If I say that's coming in the next slide, make sure it comes in the next slide. So I want to feel comfortable having a dialogue with you this evening to answer your questions, to make sure our understandings are compatible as we go along. So I've also provided you with a handout. Looks like this on the front and this on the back. And also, with my teacher roots, we're going to start with some key terms and some vocabulary that you'll hear me using throughout our presentation. So I've given you a cheat sheet here to help guide you through, because I'll go over it at the beginning, but as we go through and those terms start coming up in our conversation, then you can refer to that information as well. So you have that available to you. All right, so here we go. So we'll start with those key terms, and the first two are aggregate and disaggregate. Aggregate data is when we roll the data all the way up to the top. So we would say, what are the third grade performance levels for English language arts in Arizona? And then we would begin to disaggregate that by saying, what are the third grade English language arts results in Peoria? What are the English language arts results in a specific school? What are the English language arts results in grade 3? So that's disaggregating. So in our time together this evening, we're going to look at aggregate, where we roll it up, and then we're going to look at disaggregate, where we roll it down into very specific elements of performance. We're going to be talking a lot about assessments. So assessments are simply tools that we use to monitor student learning. The tools that we use need to be reliable, meaning that they give us consistently quality results, and they are valid in that the results they give us are accurate. We make decisions based on this assessment data, so it's important that those tests be both reliable and valid because we use them for important decisions. Accountability is the purpose to assess school effectiveness and the quality, simply put. Achievement is progressing toward improving those student academic outcomes. Proficiency is the line where we say you pass the test, and that's all it is. It's a line that says if you get to this particular score, you have passed. So we're going to be talking about proficiency in connection with our next piece is growth, which is a different type of measurement for learning. But I need you to remember that proficiency is simply that line that tells us how close you were to passing, if you passed, and how far above that line you may have passed the assessment. So growth tells us the amount of learning that's happened in any given time. So we have point A to point B, and for our conversation this evening, it will be the spring assessment for the state in April to the following spring. So point A to point B, spring assessment for one school year, same spring assessment for the next year. So how much learning occurred in that time frame? That's how we measure growth. So we look at the two pieces together to give us a very full picture of how learning is progressing with each individual child. We'll be talking about career and technical education. We'll be talking about subgroups, which are federal and state accountability requirements that we use these subgroup data, and the U.S. Department of Education provides that list of subgroups to us. Examples will include English learners and students with disabilities. And then the last two, we'll spend some time talking about, but CSI is comprehensive support and improvement. And this is a level of support when an entire whole school falls below 5% performing in our entire state. This is support provided directly by the Arizona Department of Education. ATSI, and from a language standpoint, I will just say TSI. So if I drop the A, just know I'm talking about ATSI, is additional targeted support and improvement. And this is when we are notified that we have subgroups of students in certain schools that are falling into that bottom threshold of the state. So CSI is whole school, ATSI is subgroups of students across certain schools. And so any questions about the terminology that we'll have this evening? That's on the test. All right, let's jump in here. So we'll be working out of the student success perspective with our focus on the learning for every student, every day. So we'll do a quick journey back in history, starting back in 2002 with No Child Left Behind. I'm going to simplify these two pieces of history just to keep us moving along here. The goal of No Child Left Behind was to provide more educational opportunities for students. But what it created was school and district accountability measures, having to measure and report out on how students were performing at schools. And it was very driven by the federal government. Every Student Succeeds Act came around in 2015, so No Child Left Behind was with us for 13 years. And the goal, while you can see is slightly different, to ensure schools provide a quality education for all students, it shifted the federal government's role in accountability to the states. So it gave us the opportunity to create, like Arizona did, a model that is a multiple indicator plan to measure school effectiveness. It gives states more control to say, how do we want to measure school effectiveness in our state? Now, we get to do that here in Arizona, and we'll unpack our Arizona models because it leads to those letter grades. But it's also critical to know that the federal government determines the criteria that has to exist to measure that whole school and then those subgroups. So we'll talk into those pieces as well. So as you'll see, when we start to unpack these models, it increases transparency with our parents and our community relative to the effectiveness and the quality of our schools. And then as you see how we weight the different categories across our state systems, you'll see how those priorities are established for learning in our state. So here's a quick visual of the two models that we have here in Peoria that come from the Arizona Department of Education. The first on our left is the K-8 model, and then on the right we have the 9-12 model. And I'm going to highlight a couple areas under each of those models in purple because those are achievement measures. So we're still in the accountability section tonight, but there's some overlap between accountability and achievement. So we'll talk in depth about those areas that I've highlighted in purple when we get to that achievement section. I also want to highlight that we have a different accountability model for the Peoria Flex Academy and our eCampus. They are unique schools who serve unique purposes, and so it is fitting that the state allows us to utilize a different accountability model to measure their effectiveness. So first, we're going to unpack the K-8 Arizona model. So we'll begin with the components of each, and then we'll see how the category weights begin to establish those priorities for our schools. So we'll start with proficiency, which is 30%. And do you remember what I said about proficiency in our key terms? It's the line. How close did you get to that line? Did you pass? And how far did you get beyond the line? And those are the scores that we see published annually. ADE releases them, and our newspapers and our news media carry those. The second category is weighted at 10%. And this measures how well our language learners are progressing to acquiring English. The third area is a myriad of opportunities for schools to earn points by the different programs that they provide, such as decreasing absences, 8th grade acceleration, subgroup proficiency improvements, 3rd grade reading focuses, and decreasing low performance. So it's a myriad of opportunities within that category that weights for 10% to again show how effective we are as a school. And then finally, you see growth is at 50%. So we see that priority, the way Arizona has weighted growth at being half of what determines that letter grade. So we're gonna dive into growth, and we're going to go a little deep with this one because like I mentioned earlier, it's that distance of learning, how much learning happened, and schools get quite a number of points when we weigh into the growth component. So with growth being that highly prioritized, let's go ahead and take a look. All right, here comes your first assessment. We have two students, very creatively named, student A and student B. Here is the amount of learning that student A did in one school year. Here is the amount of learning that student B did in one school year. Here's the bar on proficiency. Which student learned more, A or B? Yes, you are correct. It is student B. So even though student B didn't cross the proficiency line, we see that amount of learning being significant. And that from point A, spring test to spring test, that student's learning was a significant amount. And that's that growth component that we really lean into. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper with this part on growth now, because I want to help you understand how growth is calculated. So we look at, well, the state really looks at, all of the students on point A of the test, the first one that they take, and they say, of all the students who scored similarly, let's compare them when they take the next test. So all the students that scored right around that same scale score, they say, all right, so in the spring, let's rank them. So we see 1 to 99 of the students who are in that same score group, and we call those students their peer groups, their academic score peer groups. And so they get a ranking because we want to compare and say that's how we know how much learning happened that year. And then the following year, they're regrouped again, and they're with their new score group. So as students progress, we expect them, in order to continue to make growth, to reach proficiency and beyond, that they continue to outperform their peers that are in their score group. Now, I went a little deeper on that because I want to share with you that prior to COVID, Arizona had a component of its accountability model that included targeted growth. That is returning, and it will impact the conversation we have about letter grades. So targeted growth takes that number and says, well, this is where little Teresa scored, and in order for her to progress as much as we believe she should, this is her new growth target. And so if Teresa doesn't make that target, the school doesn't get all the points. If she does make that target, they get the points for it. So it takes that growth weight and applies extra pieces to it to ensure that we are providing excellence in the classroom for our students. So that's a pretty heavy topic. There's a lot of information associated with growth there. But growth is really key to helping our students move into that proficiency space and move beyond the proficiency space. It's real, all students need to be challenged in our classrooms, and that's where that learning piece comes from. It's measured against their peers, and so that academic score group, we look at the kids who performed similarly, so it's very fair. Students who performed just like you did or very similar to how you did, and then we compare them. This is tied to growth as it drives proficiency. So the more that learning happens, the more students we have that get beyond proficient and into that advanced stage. All right, so let's get into our letter grades. So these are our elementary school letter grade labels. And you can see the last 2 years, school year 21-22 and 22-23, have been fairly consistent. And then you can see that there's been improvement since COVID, but as I just referenced, we do anticipate the return in this current cycle of targeted growth into that formula. So the letter grades, you see the gaps there in 20 and 21, and that is where they were suspended during COVID. So now, I'll pause for just a moment, give you an opportunity to ask questions.
Dr. Sorensen, any questions at this point?
No, sir, that was a good explanation. I have some background knowledge here, so no questions at this point. Thank you.
Okay, got it. Board members, you all good?
All right, so we're going to continue now, and we'll transition into high school accountability. So here's the chart that we saw from before. So we'll start with the high school formula being, it's fairly similar to elementary, but it has the nuances of the high school experience involved with it. And the one component that I want to call out about the high school piece that we'll see throughout is there have been lots of changes over the course of the last several years. So as those changes take place, it becomes challenging to compare year to year to year, because sometimes those changes are impacted by the actual assessment has changed, the cut scores have changed to say what passing is and what it isn't. And so those pieces are worth noting as well. So we'll start at the top like we did with elementary. Proficiency is that passing rate, and for high schools, it's 11th grade ACT. That is the assessment used for proficiency for our high schools. And similarly to elementary, English learners, how fast and how well they are acquiring English proficiency. Graduation rate with the 4-year rate for each of our cohorts of students. The subgroup improvement from year to year. as well. So we are going to look at that last category of college and career readiness in a much more deep fashion. So as we transition to college and career readiness, we'll be looking at the variety of ways we're able to measure school effectiveness for our high schools. So the accountability component here is that our college and career readiness is a set of expectations by students that measure their preparedness for their selected post-secondary pathway. So essentially, we want to make sure that the programming we're providing to students allow them the opportunity to choose any path forward of their desire. We want to prepare them so that they have all of the choices available to them. But as you can see here, the academic and career readiness, there are numerous indicators that really reflect that various experience that you can have in any one of our high schools. Peoria Unified excels in a couple of areas specifically. I want to highlight dual enrollment as an area where we traditionally score many, many points. The access that our students have to dual enroll in as many courses as they possibly can is outstanding. Our CTE pathway options are also incredible, and we score many points with the opportunities our students have to take a variety of choices from the CTE options. And then, of course, our arts education program is very strong, and I'm going to brag on them a little bit here in a little bit with the number of diplomas and seals that we have from the state for our arts program. But I wanted to further illustrate how critical that CTE component is and to share with you that at the conclusion of the 22-23 school year, we had 2,679 certifications earned across 20 CTE areas right here in our district. And that means that our students are entering high demand, high wage jobs and opportunities for them to pursue those in Arizona, and especially here in the West Valley, as well as they have the opportunity to give back to our local economy right at the point of graduation. So incredible opportunities for our students who are earning those certifications across our CTE pathways. So an additional highlight, as I mentioned, our arts program. At the conclusion of the 22-23 school year, we had 70 students receive the arts seal on their diploma from the state, and that brings our four-year total to 187 seals for art, which is absolutely incredible, and that spans across all of the varied art programs that we have here in Peoria. And I'd also be remiss not to mention the MET Professional Academy based out of Peoria High School, where students are receiving skills-based instruction with a professional lens to it, which is an incredible opportunity, again, for our students to pick up those certifications in global business, medical, engineering, and biotechnology. Did I say technology? Bioscience and technology. I didn't miss anybody. So the career and college readiness area is where we excel. And actually, one of the teachers that we visited with this morning was sharing that, and from his perspective in years past, we actually max out the scores so that they can't even add up all the points that we earn in that area in our district. So that's a thing for us to be absolutely proud of. So let's look at those letter grades. So similar to elementary's fluctuation in the models, we do notice since 17, 18, 18, 19, we do see that increase in 21, 22, 22, 23 with the gap years of COVID in 1920 and 2021. So the last 2 years have been consistent. And I do want to call your attention to the grid lines here because of the number of high schools we have. That's only one increment between each grid line. So it makes it look like a significant jump, but it's really just one increment there. So in 21, 22, we had the 5 A's and the 3 B's. And presently, it is 4 A's and 4 B's, but we are in the process of appealing the cactus letter grade that exists currently, and we feel very confident in the data that we have that our challenge and our appeal will be granted. Our research team does an amazing job keeping track of all of our data, and so we validate and double check what the state produces, and we're able to have conversations with them about the data. And so we will be submitting that appeal for cactus, and I believe we will be on the other side of it. We'll be back to having our 4 and 4 on the A's and B's for the high school. So at this time, we'll be ready to transition over to our requirements for federal accountability. So as we transition from state to federal accountability models, we'll begin with a holistic view, so at the top, and then we'll work our way down into more of a granular view, with the biggest difference being between state and federal, that focus on subgroup data. So the federal accountability component, and we're under Every Student Succeeds Act, requires for every state to submit a plan to be how we're going to evaluate our schools. That plan must focus on the lowest performing schools, and the plan that we have in Arizona is very similar to our A through F system, but with one exception. Schools are measured not only on how the whole school performs, but the school's also measured on how each of those 10 subgroups performs. So at this point, I want to call your attention to, it is possible, and we will see this, that we can have A and or B schools, according to the Arizona system, be identified as low performing for subgroups for the federal accountability system. So I want to call your attention to that, because the first time I saw it, I was like, wait, what? And so we'll take a look at that and we'll unpack how that happens and why. So as seen here, these are the federal accountability subgroups identified by the U.S. Department of Education. And I want to note at the bottom there that in order for a subgroup to be considered for any particular school, they must have no fewer than 20 students, and that is for the purpose of protecting student identity. So there are no subgroups that are totaled or counted or looked at if they are 20 or fewer students. This is what those accountability models look like, very similar to Arizona. The two biggest difference that you would see would be within the grade bands and then some of the weighting. So I shared in our key terms that the federal accountability impacts our schools, and so now we're going to take a closer look at what those impacts are. So we'll return here to our conversation about CSI, comprehensive support and improvement. And again, this is whole school. So when the whole school's performance is identified as being in the bottom 5% of Arizona schools, they are identified for immediate Arizona Department of Education support. The ATSI is referred to as additional targeted support and improvement. And this is any subgroup of those that were just on the previous slide that falls into that same bottom of the state threshold, and they are identified through this matrix. So a couple nuances to that identification. Schools and subgroups are only evaluated every 3 years. So every 3 years, we potentially have a new set of data in schools to look at. If they are identified as either CSI or TSI, because they're in that bottom component, schools have 4 years to show 2 consecutive years of improvements, and they need to reach a qualifying score to exit. And then any schools who are identified as ATSI who don't show 2 years of improvement consecutively within that 4-year time span are moved to the CSI status, which means the Arizona Department of Education will be coming to provide those supports. A couple caveats to this. The formula that is used now in 23-24 is not the same as 2018 when these schools that I'm about to show you were identified, and that's an important component. In 2018, we had just the AZ Merit proficiency scores included, so that current list of schools is based on the formula from 2018. So the list of schools is on the back of your term sheet so that you have those to refer to. All right, so let's keep moving here and we'll look at these components of federal accountability. So for the 22-23 school year, this would be the end of the last school year, there were 19 elementary schools who were identified in year 3 of the 4. There were 4 subgroups across those 19 schools. 16 of them were identified with students with disabilities, 9 identified with English learners, 3 with African American students, and 1 with multiracial students. And at that time, there were no high schools in the ATSI category. For the current school year, for 23-24, I am thrilled to be able to share with you that we had 9 schools, based on their data from the previous school year, exit ATSI. So based on their data, we've significantly reduced the number of schools as well as reduced the number of identified subgroups. So we have a lot to celebrate there at those 9 schools and understanding how they got to those successful points, the strategies and practices they did to be successful to exit the list ahead of this school year. But that does leave us with 10 elementary schools. And I do want to call out that on the list, on the backside of the terms, Canyon on the first one, we are appealing Canyon. And again, I have a lot of confidence in the data that we have here at the district and the research that we've done. And we do have confidence that we will receive approval on that appeal, which would drop that number down to 9. But as of today, it is 10. So we have those 10 schools, and they are in year 4 of 4. This is the final year. So across those 10 schools, we have 2 subgroups. 10 of them identified as students with disabilities, and 1 school is identified with students with disabilities and African American students. And again, we still have no high schools that are identified as ATSI. So you'll recall earlier from when I said that we could see an A or B school be identified through the federal accountability, and this is where we see that. So we have an urgent, oh, I'm sorry, a question.
I just wanted to ask a question before you continue on. So you mentioned that when they do have the supports that come into those schools, what are those kind of supports? What examples do you kind of have for that?
For when the state comes in, yep, so the
Yes,
state
yeah.
will come in, they will bring a prescribed model that says, and there are typically four, we call them levers in a turnaround model that addresses staffing, addresses the instructional infrastructure of how well our classrooms are operating, addresses leadership, and typically addresses culture and climate on the campus. They also have turnaround consultants that come, and they would be working directly with district staff and the school staff to put those changes in place. It is important that we put these changes in place first. So we do have a plan, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Perfect. So as I mentioned, we have an urgent and immediate need to support these particular schools that are remaining identified as ATSI. And I do want to comment on the subgroups for just a moment. The students with disabilities is the subgroup that is most common. And with that, I want to share that students with disabilities typically spend about 80 to 90% of their school day in the regular education setting. So by no means do I want anyone to interpret this data to be directly a reflection of the students' services being provided, the IEPs that are being written for our students with disabilities. So some of the work that's already been started here in Peoria, one example is that we do training with our gen ed teachers, not just about accommodations, but also how the goals in the IEP create a team approach to aligning instruction which supports those students. So there isn't a disconnect between when they're receiving their services as a student with disabilities and what's in their IEP to how they're being supported in their general education classroom. So it's really important that we note that and that this is a whole group, whole process at the school that we want to take to make sure that we don't exit and then fall right back in. So it's making systemic change that's in the best interest of student outcomes for the students in those particular schools. So that's where our improvement efforts are focused on. So as we prepare to transition from accountability to achievement, I'd like to pause just a moment to see if you have any additional questions. I know that's been a lot so far.
Dr. Sorensen, how are you doing, sir? Any questions at this point?
No, sir, thank you.
Okay. Ms. Ewing? Good. Ms. Ricks? All right.
All right.
Thank you.
So we'll now open our discussion around student achievement with the idea that if we continue to focus on quality instruction in our classrooms, academic achievement increases and accountability concerns decrease. So you're going to hear me return to that about the quality of the instruction that we're providing and why that needs to be the focus of the work that we do. So we'll begin by looking at the assessments. These at that 30,000 foot. We're not going to be talking about all of these assessments this evening, but I did want you to have the opportunity to view them, to know that there are more than just a few that we'll be talking about. These are the assessments determined to measure learning and the associated data that we use. So while we won't be discussing them all, you'll have seen them all here, so when we come together in subsequent sessions, we can refer back to these assessments. So we'll begin with Arizona's academic standards assessment. This is given to all students in grades 3 through 8 in math and English language arts. It's a combination of reading, language, and writing skills, and it's a continuation of the tests that have existed previously in Arizona with AIMS, AZ Merit, and AZM2. We won't be talking specifically about the multi-state alternative assessment this evening, but it is an important assessment given the context of our accountability conversation, which is given to grades 3 through 8 for students who have significant cognitive disabilities, and they measure proficiency in math, ELA, English language arts, and science. These tests are given each spring, and schools are required to test over 95% of their students. The Arizona Department of Education provides data to us on these yearly scores, as well as the yearly growth that we've talked quite a bit about. So with a full picture of accountability and achievement, you'll see how it's very important that we provide students with as many instructional days as we can to be able to get those in before that spring testing, because that's student proficiency and of course that's student growth. So we're going to review by assessment, by content area, by grade level, each of the achievement results. So we're going to take this first slide nice and slow together. We'll walk through it. I want to orient you to what you're looking at. So the data sets that we'll look at this evening, we'll always start with math, and then we'll move to English language arts. The proficiency rate is on the y-axis, running down the left-hand side there. And the school years are running across the x-axis at the bottom. Each of the colored lines is a grade level, and its legend is on the right-hand side of the graph there. So notice that this graph includes data all the way back to 2014-15 through the last school year. And then one other brief notation before we get into the data is that this data reflects a different set of students each year. So if we look at the third grade line, those are different third graders at each point along the way. So we're not looking at cohorts of students, how third graders performed as fourth graders, how they performed as fifth graders, but we do keep an eye on how is third grade performing every year, because our expectation would be that our kindergarten, first and second grade programming gets stronger and stronger, and we would see those proficiency numbers rise. So the data for the scores in 2023, the proficiency rate for grade 3 was 49, grade 4 is 46, grade 5 is 36, grade 6 is 37, grade 7 is 37, and grade 8 is 36. So while we do see a relatively flat and stable data, we do see that the post-COVID progress is reflected in that data. So now we'll take a look and we'll review the English language arts data in the same way. So this graph covers English language arts proficiency rates. Similar to math, our English language arts rates are generally flat and stable. We also note that there was not as significant of a decline from COVID that we saw in math. The rate of proficiency for 2023 for third grade is 44, grade 4 is 50, grade 5 is 39, grade 6 is 46, grade 7 is 47, grade 8 is 39. So as we progress in our next set of slides, we'll begin to examine this data in a disaggregated format. So we'll see this data by those U.S. Department of Education subgroups that we have. So we'll just take a moment to orient ourselves to this chart. And again, this is our math proficiency. The proficiency level number is on the left. School years run across the bottom. And the legend coordinating the data to the subgroup is on the right-hand side. In Peoria Unified, our white, Hispanic, and African American students make up about 90% of our entire enrollment. So we're going to look at those three groups aggregated together while also noting the other potentially existing achievement gaps. So the trend that we see here in our major subgroups, they are trending upward, demonstrating an increasing rate of proficiency in those subgroups. And then I'll share with you what those subgroups are as far as the numbers. So all students, and that would be the purple bar on the far left of each year, moved 4 percentage points from 36 to 40. Our African American students, that's the green bar, moved 2 percentage points from 18 to 20. Our Hispanic students, which is the light blue bar, moved 4 percentage points from 26 to 30. And our white students, which is the brown bar, moved 44 to 48, which is 4 percentage points.
According to all that the Lord has granted us, and the great goodness toward the house of Israel, which he has granted them according to his compassion and according.
So now we'll look at the same data, but for English language arts. This is that disaggregated by U.S. Department of Ed provided subgroups. So you'll notice that the English language arts data is similar to math relative to the federal accountability subgroups. And across our 3 large subgroups that make up that 90% of our enrollment, the trend is a slight increase. So we see that our African American and our Hispanic students are showing stability in the scores with some up and some down. And we show for our white students that we have a slight increase. And you'll also note that there was not as big of a drop here as we saw with the COVID components when you compare school years 21, 22, 23 to 18 and 19. So the additional information for our subgroups, all students had a 2% change from 42 to 44. The African American students, which is the green line, 1 point, 25 to 26. Our Hispanic students moved from 34 to a rate of proficiency of 35, which is 1 percentage point. And our white students moved 2 percentage points, 51 to 53. So we're going to move from our ethnicity subgroups to our disaggregated data of special populations. So here we see our math data for subgroup populations that's disaggregated. This will be our group of students with disabilities, our language learners, and students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. So we see here upwards trending for these particular subgroups, noting that our students with disabilities, which is the purple bar, showed a small increase, which moved them to a 15% proficiency rate. Our students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch, which is the red line, grew slightly at a 26% rate of proficiency. And our language learners, which are the orange line, are showing good growth but are still very low at a 10% passing rate. So I do want to pause here because I want to surface an area of concern for us, noting that our language learners are experiencing less success academically than our students with disabilities. And as you know, Peoria Unified was notified that we had been selected for 12 of our schools to receive EL monitoring visits from the Arizona Department of Education. So in preparing for that visit, we do know already we've identified areas of improvement that will give us opportunities to provide services differently and in a better form or fashion for our language learners. And we do expect to learn more as that process continues to support us with what we're seeing here as a very concerning data component.
So I don't know if this is off topic, but do we know what that's going to look like? Or if we don't really know enough yet, can I just make a request that once we do know what that process is, that maybe a Friday report, that you could throw that our way, just so that we're aware? If people ask us, then that way.
Most recent information is in last Friday's update.
Okay. All right, thanks.
And we will keep you updated as we move through.
Okay, thanks.
So as we've done so far, here's our chart for English language arts proficiency rates among special population subgroups. Again, students with disabilities, our language learners, and those students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch. For these subgroups, there is bigger discrepancy for English language arts because that content area is simply more language heavy. We do show for all students, which is the green bar, slight increases. For our students with disabilities, slight increase as well at 15 as a proficiency rate. Students eligible for free and reduced lunch at a 30 proficiency rate, which is the red bar. And then our language learners in the orange bar, still showing low growth, but a 6% passing rate. So while we do observe an upward trend with slight increases, clearly we still have more work to do in this area. So before I leave our study of achievement, I want to remind us that it's important to consider our performance through the lens of comparison to other districts. So before I move there, I want to pause and see if we have any questions.
On the English language learners, have the models that we've been using to teach these students, has that significantly changed or shifted?
So I would say they have, but it fell right into that COVID timeframe when the state had introduced the model years back, and we usually have a year or two to adjust to it, bring it on, do your training, get ready, practice using it, and then put it in place. And it was right into that COVID timeframe, so it did create some challenges with students being remote and the new models coming into play. So work that we're continually doing with our language learner supports and the teachers that support those students is implementing those models at a more effective level.
And is it difficult to recruit teachers into that specific subject area?
It is difficult to recruit teachers. Yes.
So I'm just wondering, and this is just my wondering, when we went through COVID, I mean, everybody reacts to pandemic or a crisis a little bit differently, right? And even from a cultural perspective, with some of the English language learners, although we were one of a few districts, and if I'm not mistaken, Ms. Ari, probably first district to go back, right, following that winter. And just wonder if that just change from a cultural perspective, and our understanding as a district, those cultural nuances may have played into kind of what we're seeing from a data and success rate.
So while I won't speak to the culture component of it, I would speak to the language acquisition piece. So we know language is acquired, listening, speaking, reading, writing, typically in those domains in that area. And when you are not around in a social situation to pick up the listening piece, to be able to speak, and then to have opportunities to develop those components so that you can begin to read, writing being an application of reading, we see that downhill on why that could be particularly troubling for language learners.
Dr. Sorensen, any questions at this point, sir?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to move to look at district comparisons. So once again, I want to orient you to a new graph and a new data view. These are proficiency rates by district by grade level passing rate. So on the left, we have the proficiency rate, and on the bottom, in small print, we have the grade levels, and just below that, we have the names of comparable districts to us. So the purple on the left is the state's aggregate data with the districts to follow, and the red, which is this horizontal line, is the Peoria Unified Performance. So the takeaways here underscore how critical it is that we focus on supporting our educators to be equipped with the highest quality of resources, to promote standards alignment, focusing on what all learners need, transparency with our parents and our families, to be supported to use high leverage instructional strategies, and to be afforded opportunities to participate in quality professional learning right here in Peoria Unified. So that's the math data. Let's go ahead and take a look at the language arts data. The red horizontal line being Peoria Unified Performance. So we're confident in the work that we've started and the work that we're continuing with what's in our strategic plan and the key components of reimagining learning and teaching with ways that are going to enhance learning in our classrooms that are going to help us catch up. So with that, this concludes the first portion for elementary achievement, and now we'll go ahead and progress into elementary growth. So you'll recall we reviewed this information earlier about measuring growth. So I just want to highlight a couple reminders before we get into the data. So as we shift our focus from analysis of proficiency to growth, I want you to remember student A and student B. Growth is the amount of learning across a period of time, and we're talking about one test instance in the spring of one year and the second test instance in the spring of the next year. And this is regardless of proficiency in that passing score. And then as we review, I want you to keep these three performance bands in your peripheral. 0 to 33 for growth is considered lower growth. 34 to 66 is considered typical growth, so the amount we would expect across a given school year. And 67 to 99 is considered high growth. And I'll repeat those as we go through, but I want to keep those performance cuts in your mind as we review the data. So we'll take just a moment to orient ourselves here to a new graph for our math median student growth percentiles. On the left-hand edge, you have your median student growth. So you remember earlier when I was droning on about 1 to 99 and ranking the students and all of those pieces and parts. So this median score is the middle number for growth. So we have all the students, just like you would with your data, and you'd line it all up, just like we learned in math. You take the median as that middle number. So this is that median score by grade level for us. See, I told you it would be important later on. So as we note, I want you to remember that we need 2 test scores to get a growth score. So we won't have growth for our 3rd graders because the first time they take the state assessment is at the end of 3rd grade. So we don't see their growth scores until the end of 4th grade for them. And then you'll also note that 4th grade, those untested years due to COVID, they wouldn't have had a growth score either until they had those 2 opportunities to assess. So I'm going to share with you now what those growth scores are for the 2023 school year. Grade 4, got the bands handy. 0 to 33 is low, 34 to 66 is typical, 67 to 99 is high. Grade 4 is 53. Grade 5 is 43. Grade 6, 61. Grade 7, 53. And grade 8 is 55. So you'll see that we aren't falling further behind because all of those growth scores fall within that typical range. But in order to catch up and move up, we need to boost those growth scores into that high range of that 67 to 99. So when we talk about student growth, those are the numbers that we're progress monitoring to look for. So now we're going to look at our English language arts data through the same lens. So very similar to math, here's our graph for English language arts and our growth scores. Again, we're looking for that 0 to 33, 34 to 66, and 67 to 99. Grade 4 is a growth score in 2023 of 51. Grade 5 was 46. Grade 6 is 50. Grade 7 is 51. And grade 8 is 51. So similar to math, we're not falling behind, but we do need to see those growth scores increasing up into that 67 to 99 band to help us catch up and to see those proficiency scores that we worked through earlier rise higher. So this concludes the achievement section for elementary as we've covered proficiency and growth. And now we'll move into transition to our high school achievement data. So as I shared earlier, for our high schools, there have been numerous changes over the last several years that impacted the actual tests that students were required to take, the areas that were tested, as well as some changes to even the cut points of those assessments saying what is proficiency and what's above proficiency. So when the state moved to ACT, and we're in a 5-year contract as a state, and we're in year 3, we have 2 solid years of very comparable data that we'll be looking at from the 21-22 school year and the 22-23 school year. And one other caveat that I want to mention, Arizona and a few other states like us test all 11th graders. It is a requirement. Other states make it optional. So students who see themselves as being college bound would be the ones most likely, outside of a requirement, to take the assessment. So when we compare our average composite to other states, we want to always look and see which students are they testing and is it a requirement, so we make sure we're looking at apples to apples. But in Arizona, all 11th graders test. All right, so let's orient ourselves here. We're looking at ACT proficiency. On the left edge is the percent bar for proficiency, and then we've got our content areas of math on the left and English language arts on the right. For math in 2022, which is the purple bar on the far left, the proficiency rate was 34. For 2023 in math, it increased to 37. That blue bar that crosses the red at the top, that's the state of Arizona at 32. So you can see that we're outpacing the state as well as continuing to show improvement in math for our ACT proficiency rates. For the last school year, 22-23, so the purple bar, that was 39% for English language arts, which increased to 45% at the end of the 2023 school year. And the blue bar across the red at the top is the state coming in at 40%. So again, similar to math, we are outpacing the state and we are continuing to see improvement with those proficiency rates. So similar to elementary, how we discussed the disaggregated data by subgroup, we'll now do that for high school. So as we're reviewing the ACT subgroup data, I want you to note that all of the subgroups are listed on this specific slide. For elementary, we split them across 2 groups. We have them all listed here in one session, simply because there's less data just across the 2 years. And also note that free and reduced lunch eligibility is not a part of the ACT data set, as we do not receive that information. So I'll start right away with the data. So all students is the dark green bar on both sides of 22 and 23, which moved from 34 to 37 with a 3% point increase. Black students, which are the orange bar, moved from 10 to 19, which is a 9 percentage point increase. Hispanic students, which is the light green bar, moved from 28 to 25. Our white students moved from 35 to 45, which is a 10% percentage point increase. And our EL students, which is the maroon bar, went from 1 to 2. And our students with disabilities moved from 1 to 4, a 3% percentage point increase.
The Pacific Islanders, isn't that the one that really jumped?
Mm-hmm.
What was that difference?
No, I don't have that one
I don't
right
know.
here.
It's all right.
I'll get it for you.
Thanks.
And so we'll look similarly now for ACT with our English Language Arts proficiency. All students moved from 40 to 45 with a 5 percentage point increase. Our black students moved from 10 to 28, which is an 18% point increase. Our Hispanic students moved from 21 to 34, which is a 13-point increase. Our white students moved from 30 to 54, which is a 24 percentage point increase. And both of our groups in English learners and special education decreased for respectively by 3 and 2 points. So while we do see impressive gains, we remain aware of our achievement gaps for both math and English language arts. And similar to our elementary data review, we'll now go ahead and look at our district comparable data. So for comparison purposes, we're looking at average scale score, not passing rate. And that's so that we're able to see more content areas that are assessed within the ACT. So you see on the moving left to right, we have the composite, and then we have an average scale score by district for math, science, English, reading, writing, which I'll talk about here in a moment, and then English language arts. English language arts is a combination score of English, reading, and writing. So we're able to use that average scale score to be able to see more information from ACT. So let me speak to the red line, which is the Peoria Unified Performance. And then the blue box around writing, I want to highlight that the range only goes to 12. So it's not that all of the districts that we're comparing ourselves to aren't doing well in writing. It's simply the other scale is 36 and this scale is 12. So we see there that we're all performing relatively similarly. So at this point, we've studied accountability and achievement with aggregate and disaggregate data views. And we've identified needs for continuous improvement for our academic students for our progress here. So now we want to transition into how the district is making progress monitoring happen with our local assessments. So knowing what our data tells us about the areas of strength and our growth opportunities, we take our strategic plan and we make it actionable through continuous improvement. And continuous improvement is a process that we've used here in our district, and it's using a needs assessment. So every school brings their leadership team together. It includes their site administration, their teachers, their site council with parents involved, and guidance from us here at the district office. And they complete a needs assessment that gives us an idea of where do they see their greatest challenges and what are the areas they're going to commit to working on through this year's plan. So when we have all that data, we loosely call it sort of a meta-analysis, and we're able to look across all of our schools and say, what are the most common needs being identified? And then we take the district resources, our staffing, our materials, and we align it to what our schools are saying their needs are. So that, then we're able to, just like we don't wait until the big test to find out how things are going, we monitor the progress throughout the school year using our own assessments. So, and we've begun using an assessment at our high schools now to be able to provide the same information at our high schools. So because that's the first year out and they just completed their first window, we're gonna look at the 2 assessments that we have for grades 3 through 8. So first we'll review an aggregate view of kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade iReady data for math. iReady is a diagnostic. It's given 3 times a year to measure progress and placement for each student. Teachers are given detailed information on domain strengths and weaknesses for their entire class and for each individual student in their room. The test takes about 45 minutes, and teachers receive that data literally within minutes of the students completing the assessment. The fall test is given in the first 2 weeks of the school year, so it is somewhat of a pre-test. We want our teachers to know and understand what it is our children are already being successful with, so they know where that starting point is. So the data that we're looking at here is from the fall of 22-23 to the current fall. And we're looking at the percentage and the numbers of students who were at or above grade level in math at the start of the school year. So what this tells us is that last year, there were 3% more students starting at grade level. But again, for math, this is very common to see. This is when you're at home, you may have opportunities to read with your child. Doing math sometimes with children is a little bit more challenging. So we would expect to see this for math. All right, so we'll move into our diagnostic. This is for iReady reading, K1, 2, and 3. So we see with this year's data with K through 3 that nearly 1% more students are starting at or above grade level at the start of the school year. And that is an indicator for us that we're able to look at the practices in those early grades and understand where we're seeing those success so that they can be repeated as well. So it's very promising that we're seeing more students at the start of this year at or above grade level, starting out with the content, than we saw last year. So iReady is also used for our mandatory reporting for Move On Reading here in Arizona, and it's also used as our early dyslexia screener, which is also required here in Arizona. The second assessment that we use for monitoring progress is called Transcend. Transcend is given in October for the first time. So October 13th, I believe, was the window. So this data is very new. Transcend is a benchmark assessment. It's given to grades 3 through 8 in math and in reading. Test takes approximately 45 minutes, and it provides feedback to the teachers on the domains where we are seeing success with our students. The information is provided to teachers and schools within about 20 minutes of the students finishing the assessment, and it is one of the primary sources that our teachers use to drive their instruction. Identify how students are performing, make changes to how you're delivering your instruction based on what we've identified as their needs and their strengths. These assessments are given quarterly, and they're cumulative of standards beginning in the year. The district designs each test's blueprint based on our scope and sequence. So students are being tested on the standards that have been taught in that particular window of time. If you're a data nerd like I am, this next piece is really exciting. These tests have proven to have a high correlation to the spring AASA assessment with a correlation coefficient above 0.8, which is amazing. Just don't see that very often. So what that tells us is at this point in our current school year, there are almost 9% more students in math who are predicted to demonstrate proficiency on the state assessment in spring already than we saw last year, which is certainly a nod to the work that our teachers are doing with the quality of their instruction and their use of resources in our classrooms. And that's for math. So similarly for reading, the data tells us here that this year nearly 2% more students in grades 3 through 8 are already predicted to be proficient or higher on the state assessment in those standards that they've been working on already at this school year. So as we reflect on both math and reading, we can draw the conclusion that the level of instruction being provided by our educators continues to strengthen. And we're just so appreciative of their hard work every single day to make these things happen. So I now want to move us into the final stretch. It's not really the final stretch. It's the second to last final stretch. So let's talk more about our strategic plan and continuous improvement. So the final stretch here anchors us in continuing to improve and execute on our strategic plan through continuous improvement. We have this urgent need to support our schools identified as TSI. So one of the first things that we've done is we've hired for the one-year position of this new executive director who will be supporting those specific schools with a focus on leadership and coaching and that instructional infrastructure that we know is so important to the classroom. We are working to also, oops, my slide didn't go. There we go. You guys got to tell me these things. We're also working to potentially bring in support because like I said, when schools move to CSI, the state is coming in with a framework that will be how school improvement will be handled. So we're looking to bring in and support with a framework as well because again, we're going to do these things to support for the remainder of this school year because we have this last chance with this bucket of data that we have coming this spring to move as many of those schools and hopefully all of them out of that identified ATSI space. And so we've also reorganized academic services to better meet the needs of all learners. As you've heard me talk about in January and February of this year, we've reorganized the seats in our department to really clearly identify who are the students that we serve, what are the resources we use to serve with, and then how is it that we're providing quality instruction in the classroom. So the high leverage instructional strategies. We have team members dedicated to supporting and coaching in our classrooms to make those things come to fruition. So as you know, we have research-based, rigorous expectations built into our new resources for math and science that are aligned to the Arizona standards. You are also aware that we have recently implemented Canvas as a learning management platform that sophisticates the learning and teaching area. And we all know now that if you miss Algebra 1 on Tuesday at 9 a.m., you're still accountable for the information. And it's not like back in the day, well, I'll just get the work. Canvas allows us to provide the information to students, whether their mom scheduled an orthodontist appointment for them or not, and whether or not they may not have been in class that day, but they have access to the content at any time. And additionally, if they're in class that day and they're doing their homework at night, they have the opportunity to refer back to the information the teacher posted in their digital classroom for them. So they aren't cut off from the lecture information or the notes that they took or the information the teacher provided, but it's really allowing us to provide more access for our students to the content as they're working through it in their homework and their classwork. And additionally, we'll be turning on the parent side. So the parent app is coming, and this will provide more transparency for parents. Right now, like I do, I look over my child's shoulder and I can see the entire class. I can see where they've been, I can see what they're working on right now, and I can see where they're going. But when the parent component comes on with it, I'll have my own login to look at what she's up to in her classwork. And then finally, one exciting thing that we've done this summer, we started right out of the gates with a sort of conference style that we called Learning Launch. So we engaged with our professional administrators, our assistant principals, instructional coaches, and we jump-started the school year immediately talking about what's happening in our classrooms. We talked about how we're going to support our teachers, how we're going to respond to the needs of every student every day, and we started our school year that way together as adult learners. They had the opportunity to get one step ahead in learning our new math and science, one step ahead with learning Canvas, and many of the other new pieces that have come on. It was a wonderful time for us as adult learners to come together and grow as well. And the expertise that we have right here in Peoria Unified certainly shined during our time together. So some key takeaways. the summary piece of where we're at. Our grades 3 through 8 in math and English language arts are showing slight growth to close the impact of that COVID gap. High school ACT scores have showed 3 to 6% increase in proficiency over the last 2 years. Subgroups across all grade levels and tests have become a priority to close those achievement gaps, and the district has a focus maintained on improvement for every student. But there are a few challenges, and we've started addressing them. The teacher shortage is very real, particularly across our state in grades 6 through 8, math, science, and special education. And we see the same thing here in Peoria Unified. Also in our state, we have changing demographics and growth changes as well. And here in Peoria Unified, over the last 2 years, we now have 2 more schools identified as Title I, bringing our total to 26. And of course, there's also across our state an increase in the percentage of special education identification, having moved as a state from about 14.6, just crossing that 16% threshold. So other things that we work closely with, that everything impacts academics on the HR side with hiring, recruitment, retention, and those processes that will impact academics if we can't get better, stronger, faster in those areas and providing quality teachers. How we utilize our space, all of those things impact academics, and so they are challenges that we know of, and they are challenges that come to us head on. So what we're continuing to do is evaluate existing programs and resources. So we've begun evaluation of our signature programs at our schools that host those programs. We want to check to see what is it the school's mission was, what should we see that data looking like for those students from a success criteria standpoint. We are continually evaluating our implementation of our new resources as well as our ELA resources that were adopted a few years back. And we're reviewing our previously adopted supplemental resources. Again, you hear me talk about tight standards alignment, transparency with families and parents, and ensuring that all learners can benefit from the resources that we have in our classrooms. We'd also like to do monitoring reporting for our governing board at least 3 to 4 times a year. So as the data comes in from our local assessments, we'd like the opportunity to share that with you, as well as an annual data summary presentation. Much of what we covered this evening comes in 2 buckets of data, so we can cover achievement once and we can cover growth the next time we have that information, but we would like to be able to provide that to you as well. So before I conclude my comments, I want to thank Mr. Moss and the research team for their attention to detail and their work on putting all of these graphs and charts together for us. And I'd also like to thank them for their patience every time I moved a comma or added a word here and there. They were fantastic, and I'm really appreciative of the work that they've done to support us and being able to look at the accountability and the achievement data here in Peoria Unified.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez. That's a lot, for sure. Dr. Sorensen, questions, comments?
Yeah, first thing I'd like to say thank you for the presentation, Dr. Hernandez. I know, I think I share a bias towards graphs as well, so I appreciate the wide array of graphs that you shared with us. I guess I would just like to say that and remind people that the student growth measure is a far better measure of learning than subgroup proficiency improvement, because when you look at subgroup improvement from year to year, you're comparing completely different children. So sometimes that can be misleading. I know you mentioned that, but I just wanted to emphasize it, so I appreciate it. I do have a question. Do we have and use teacher-made district unified assessments that we use to measure learning and respond to that align with some of these accountability assessments?
Yes, we do have course assessments at the high school, so midterms and finals that our teachers were a part of creating over the years. And at the elementary level, similar to that, they utilize CFAs, common formative assessments, that in their PLC, professional learning community setting, that they evaluate the learning that's happened in their classrooms, and they develop those assessments to measure and progress monitor when they go back to do the instruction component of it. So we will also, as I'd like to note, with our new resources and the alignment to the rigor of the AZ standards, we will be reviewing those assessments to see if any of those do need those updates to them in the next iteration.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I definitely appreciate the importance of teacher-made assessments that we act on, so I appreciate that. When we look at slide 43 as part of our plan, could you review just shortly, I'm sorry, how are we going to use that FTE of a new executive director for a year? Just can you remind me? I apologize.
So the new position is going to be overseeing, so similar to our existing K-12 elementary education directors, we have 2 right now that are carrying all of the elementary schools. So a percentage of the TSI schools will go to this new position where they will manage the oversight of those schools. The focus will be on school improvement and school administration and supporting our school leaders to grow in their leadership in those particular schools, as well as being on the ground present and supporting the instructional infrastructure changes that will need to be happening on those sites.
Okay, I look forward to seeing if that position goes through, what we get out of it in regard to how are we getting closer to actually becoming a PLC, and how are we tracking these SMART goals and that entire process that you kind of described, that I hope we are leading. So I look forward to seeing what could potentially come out of that. I got to tell you, I'm a little concerned with the idea of bringing in outside consultants. We already allocate a significant amount of resources in a half-day Wednesday, early release Wednesday, to do the PLC process. So I would just express some initial concerns about that. I do really appreciate the emphasis on Canvas. It can be a great tool. I just hope we have training opportunities for students and parents, because Canvas can really be a great tool to increase transparency for our community. They can see what's going on. It's a great tool when kids are gone. But I know that sometimes with technology, it can create a divide between the have and have-nots. And I just hope we have a planned outreach to parents to teach them so they can see what their kids need to do as well, so they can be partners in the learning. So I appreciate that effort. Thank you. And finally, I would just leave it. My last comment is most of these accountability measures have some form of test to it. And I just always think about how much testing is too much. And I just hope that our testing that we can control is purposeful and meaningful, because sometimes we can just try to suck all the fun out of learning. And I just really appreciate the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sorensen. Ms. Ewing?
So I would echo the concerns about the training and consulting services. I think I just would want to, and I think as that goes forward, you guys would bring that to us anyway, of what would be the requirements that you would want for them, you know, the targets and stuff, and what is the requirements that we're looking for that service to provide. So just more information on that. And I can say that certainly echoing what he said in regards to bringing in the parents, that when I think about especially like our English language learners, that being able to think about our families that coming in, we may need to think about, do we need to have somebody there who can help with it if there's at all a language barrier, or, and actually that goes with any of our families, but just really making sure that we're bringing in education for our families. And I saw, he's not here, Mr. Nuttall, I spoke to him about one of the schools had a parent university where they were trying to teach the parents how to use a lot of the technology that we have. And I had made the suggestion that when we do these curriculum nights, that would be an excellent opportunity to tell the kids, bring your computer, pull it up, walk through it with the kids so the parent can see it at the same time. So I think that's certainly a really big, important piece, and I just wonder if we'd see more growth with certain populations, if we brought in the parents and educated them on what's happening with our school. I really, really appreciate all of this data. It really allows us to focus on the academics and what our schools need, and then certainly meeting the requirements of the state and federal and so forth. So I assume that we'll have a meeting that's going to be more in depth of some more improvements. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Ewing. Mrs. Ricks?
Yeah, great presentation. That was very awesome to kind of break it down, and so that not only the board understands, but the community too, listening in, and they can go back and watch it and see how everything works. I think with the students with disabilities at those schools, whatever the Arizona Department of Ed kind of strategizes for everybody here with that, if maybe you could kind of fill us in later on when that does happen, so we can kind of see like how we're supporting those students with disabilities. And then I think also, if possible, the site needs assessments, I know that you mentioned that, if we could also kind of see that too, so that we can kind of see what they are asking for, if that's okay to ask too. So, but otherwise, that was a great presentation, so thank you to you and all your staff.
So I do want to mention, so far as that needs assessment, the last year of the current version is now, and the state has changed it for next year. So we are supporting our schools right now in learning the new comprehensive needs assessment that's the foundation of that work. So we'll be happy to share the data that we have that's pointing us in the direction that we're on this year. And then as that plan develops for how we're going to implement the continuous needs assessment, we'll share that with you too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Rooks. Yeah, I definitely want to lift up something that Dr. Sorensen said, and I believe Mrs. Ewing also echoed, was just in and around Canvas and the engagement of parents and families with that, I'm going to call it new tool, right? I mean, as you talked about, the new curriculum that came in and textbook adoption, all that stuff, and how that is a major shift in the district and what some of our teachers and staff are going through to acclimate, right? And everybody kind of works a little differently in those environments of change, or reacts to those environments of change a little bit. And I think the same with parents, right? We talked about the diversity of our district and making sure that as that rolls out, Canvas to the parents, ensuring that we're sensitive to those cultural nuances. But I guess really my overall question is this: do we already have, a thought on how Canvas is going to roll out, or is rolling out, with our families or parents to make sure that they're successful and using that tool to be supportive and partners?
Yes, so we have a communication plan as well as internally preparing. So our school leaders will have an opportunity, and I don't know the number off the top of my head, we've had several sessions that will be offered for them in helping teachers be prepared for when their classroom is available on the parent side. So what should it look like? What information do we want to make sure that all parents have access to? We have a number of parents who have students at the elementary and a number of students that also at a high school. And so how should they look different? What will look different about those? And so we're preparing our staff for those components, and our director of ed tech and our manager of curriculum instruction are working on those two pieces together right now. So it's not just the technology, but it's also the instructional components that come along with it, because we don't want to have them be separate, because it's really about the one thing and why they work together so well. And so then in January, we'll do the communications component where we'll let parents know that the application has been turned on and you can now download it from the App Store. We'll lean into our public relations colleagues to help us with those communications, but they'll be accompanied with those training opportunities, the videos to help them with those so they can do it on their own time, as well as opportunities when they come in to visit their sites for those events that schools do to get those training components as well.
Gotcha. No, thank you for that, and thank you for that sensitivity, and obviously any language barriers that we may be confronted with would be great to understand and overcome. When we go through presentations like this, and it's presented with a lot of data and numbers, one thing that is important, I believe for us to keep in mind is there are individuals behind each and every one of these numbers, right? And, I've said it before, as a district, I'm absolutely proud of the intentionality that exists throughout Peoria Unified to look beyond what's right in front of us, look beyond the numbers to understand where our students are, to make sure that we're implementing those programs, those solutions to make sure that all of our students have an equitable opportunity to be successful throughout our district. So thank you for that. I do have a question from a collaboration perspective. You showed a couple slides that represented neighboring districts and districts, I'm going to just call them like districts, right? How much collaboration and, does it make sense to, have conversations with districts outside of Peoria Unified to even discuss, best practices, what they're doing and where they can learn from us as well. But just to glean and have another lens, as we continue to want to improve, right, from a continuous improvement perspective, to continue to be great and continue to be, held on a pedestal as a district, by our families and communities. So can you talk a little bit about that?
So we are active members in the North Valley Education Consortium, or NEVIC, and it's hosted by Deer Valley every other month, I believe. Directors, folks in roles like mine, we do come together. We have a collective agenda. So any of the common challenges that we're experiencing, we're able to discuss those and understand various perspectives from other districts. We often have the opportunity to learn from others, and others have the opportunity to learn from us as well, in the experiences that we're having, particularly supportive areas when new policies come into play and laws change, and understanding how are you communicating this, what does this look like, how are you working on this in your classrooms, those components. Another component of that is that they have a subset for the specialist group. So this is where all of our content coaches, our instructional coaches, and our educational technology coaches are able to go and join the coaches from our neighboring districts. And they had their very first meeting of the school year, so I popped over to just welcome them all in the Deer Valley boardroom, and the energy in that room is amazing. Those are the folks that are the closest to the learning and teaching that's happening, and the excitement among groups. They split up into their content areas and go into the science area and all their science things, and the social studies folks and over in their area, world languages, all the pieces. Our CTE teams were represented as well. And so they meet a couple times during the school year, and I believe I signed us up to host in the spring. Gotta remember that.
No, that's awesome. Thank you for that. And the last thing I'll say is just this. I mean, thank you for the transparency. Clearly, we're a large organization, and there are a lot of great things that take place throughout the district, and we have opportunities as well. So understanding those opportunities just help us be better and to understand what we need to do to overcome those and continue to be great. So thank you for that. Oh, go ahead.
I have another question. Okay, so the 10 schools, I know those aren't the only schools that have students with disabilities. So I know that you mentioned that we are looking at, the schools that got out of that category or showed growth, comparing what did they do and certainly what were the successes they had, and can we implement that here? I wonder if there's a possibility that we need to be looking at, are we having had a child that has a disability, but are we providing, like, the evaluations for those students? Did we put the right accommodations in place for them? So, and is that a piece that may be looked at, especially because it seems to be this particular subgroup? So, number one, will we go back and look at the evaluations to make sure we captured all of the needs of those specific kids? And do we have the right accommodations in place? Certainly we have to make sure, like, all of our staff understands what those accommodations are and that they're meeting those accommodations. But I'm just wondering if that's going to be a big piece of it, is really looking at that. Because if we don't have the right accommodations in place, then we're not setting them up for success.
Yes, that is accurate. And as I mentioned, the piece around the disconnect sometimes that occurs between what's in that IEP and what's happening in the general education classroom, that's our very first area that we're addressing and bringing those components together.
All right, if no further questions or comments, Dr. Hernandez, team, thank you very much. Mr. Molino. All right, with that said, we will move on to 3.2, Facilities Master Planning Program.
President Sandoval, members of the governing board, cabinet and guests, Tonight, administration is going to be giving an update on the facilities master planning program, and the projects that we're going to be talking about have a direct impact on all four perspectives of the strategic plan. We're going to start off in the agenda giving an update on all the completed projects over the last 6 months that we've presented to you over the last school year, going into detail for where we're at with the Lake Pleasant Elementary School building, speaking about the ADM facilities assessment, specifically for the high schools and data that was presented to the Citizens Advisory Committee over the last few years, and governing board member requests. Then we're going to be talking about this building, the District Administration Center, specifically in the areas of ADA accessibility. And then we'll be finalizing with current operational needs and future items and decisions that we need to make in the school district. These completing items, I'm not going to go over all of them. Some of them you've had reports and updates through Friday reports throughout the summer. The ones I want to concentrate on are Lake Pleasant Elementary School, the library remodel, and the Liberty High School library remodel. Those projects were completed, and they were done to be able to expand the capacity of the school, either indirectly or directly in regards to instructional spaces. For Lake Pleasant Elementary School, the architectural and engineering drawings are completed. We are waiting on one study for the soil. Once we get those results back, we will be submitting to the city for permitting. We hope that that'll happen by the end of next week, or definitely before the Thanksgiving break. The city permitting process, we would expect it to be completed by early to mid-December, so that then we can release the bid process for the construction bid and through the Ms. Meyer's department before winter break. The bid process would complete in January, and then we would bring back the construction award to the governing board in February. From the last time that you saw the layout of the Lake Pleasant building, we made some minor changes, specifically if you look where the mouse is, the doors in between the classrooms. The school really, based off teacher feedback inside administration, want to continue the normal model that we've done from the time that we've built our last 5 or 6 schools, and that is having adjoining classroom doors. So we added those. Then we also made changes. We added one rear entry or rear exit door, and this is a sidewalk here along the back with one rear exit door. The other major change that we made was we added 2 single occupancy restrooms. So there is still the traditional boys restroom, traditional girls restroom, 2 single occupancy restrooms for students. Inside the staff lounge, there is 1 single occupancy restroom for staff. As I mentioned earlier, through the Citizens Advisory Committee, going back to the data that I found was 2017, 2018. We have presented several times through that committee in regards to the need for updating our restrooms district-wide. In 2019-20, when the ADM facilities assessment was done, there was a large portion of critical and essential needs, specifically in regards to restrooms. The last time this data was presented to the Citizens Advisory Committee was March 28th of 2023. And then in the governing board meetings of May 22nd and June 22nd of 2023, President Sandoval asked for an update and what it would look like to look at restrooms. And I can't remember the exact wording that you used, President Sandoval, but increasing single occupancy restrooms throughout the high schools or throughout all schools.
Yeah, and I think for me, it was just, how we really adapt our facilities, in this case, restrooms, to accommodate the shifting needs of our student population, right? Across, many vectors.
So before we talk about restrooms, I want to set the picture of what the data for restrooms looks like. So this is data that was presented to Citizens Advisory over the last few years. We have approximately 1,133 restrooms district-wide. You see the breakdown in elementary, high school, and district office sites. The main concern in regards to restrooms per the ADM facility assessment and critical and essential needs is the age of restrooms, the aesthetics of restrooms, and the ADA accessibility, specifically for schools that were built before the 1991, 1990 ADA standards. For example, this building was built in '89. The restrooms are ADA compliant per the year that was built, but since then there's been 2 revisions to the ADA accessibility standards, and so all our buildings are compliant, but there has been new accessibility standards. But as long as we don't make major changes to the buildings, we are grandfathered in. Through the Citizens Advisory, we broke down all the restrooms, the 1,133 restrooms, into 3 different phases based off age. So 40 years old, 25 to 39, and then 10 to 24 years old. When we look at that data and only at the high schools, that leaves Cactus High School is the only school with restrooms over 40 years old. The reason Peoria High School is not there is the amount of bond projects and building renovations that they have happened. So they have a new A building, new B building, new gym, Old Main was redone, new administration center. Ironwood High School is right at the cusp. I believe Ironwood High School was built in 1986, so it's getting to that 40-year mark. Ironwood also has a true need for increased amount of ADA accessible restrooms. So before I talk about this slide, over the last probably 6 months, I have met with the 3 staff association groups, multiple student stakeholder groups, individual students, individual parents, community members, architects, districts, read on multiple white papers on what architectural firms are doing nationwide, what new build-outs of new K-12 schools, not just in Arizona, but throughout the country in higher education. So based off that, based off the need in regards to tying directly to the critical and essential needs of the ADM facility assessment, what we're going to be doing right now to start off with in phase 1 is remodel 1 set of student male and female restrooms at the 2 highest critical and essential needs schools in the restroom category per the ADM facility assessment, adding or creating multiple single occupancy restrooms. And we're going to start off with Cactus High School and Ironwood High School. I've spoken with all the high school principals and several elementary principals. My next step, and I'll work also if Dr. Larson is available, is I will be working with the 2 principals of those schools, and I'll explain this in the next slide. We will be getting stakeholder input from the parents, students, and staff of those schools during the design phase, once we have an architect chosen, and then after completion. We're going to use the feedback they give both during the design phase and after completion to then use that as we move on to the other schools. Then we'll follow the same process, getting stakeholder input from the parents, students, and staff of those schools as we build the designs. So the estimated cost for a restroom renovation, the way we're thinking right now, is around $500 a square foot. But this will be determined by a few things. As we work with site administration, we're going to find a location, so a set of restrooms within Cactus High School and Ironwood High School. We're going to be looking at several factors: the feasibility of that renovation, the usage. So in speaking with students from both of those schools and the student council students from all the 7 high schools, is they really gave me input on, well, we would prefer they were towards the outskirts, but maybe the restrooms in the cafeteria, but then those are only used during certain times versus restrooms that are in the central area of the campus. So we're really going to work with site administration and students in regards to what location, we're going to look at the usage, the feasibility, the ADA accessibility assessment of those restrooms. That will, once we pick the location, that will tell us the size, because we have the square footage of all the restrooms district-wide, and then that will determine the cost. So I'll pause right there. So that is how we're going to start moving forward with this piece. Is there any questions so far before I move on to the next slide?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the timing, or the timeline, I should say? I know you said Cactus and Ironwood, I believe, were the first two.
We'll start with Cactus and Ironwood High Schools first.
And
I'm hoping that we'll start having the first conversations with site administration probably right after Thanksgiving. Gathering the data. I'll work with Ms. Myers in the facilities department and picking an architectural firm. And then we'll start getting that feedback, doing drawings, go through that process. Most likely it'll need permits. So the intent would be to get it to some point for these two schools of a build out between spring break and early summer.
gotcha, and then the other schools will
And then
follow.
we'll follow, not after completion, as soon as we get to a point that we can move forward with the others, and I get July 1 funding, then I will start the next round of schools.
Gotcha. Okay. Dr. Sorensen, questions, comments at this point?
Thank you for the information. I really appreciate it. And I actually have to leave right now.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for the time that we had with you. And, any questions that you have, you can certainly forward those to the district.
Thank
All
you
right.
very much. Thank
All right,
you,
sir.
everyone.
Have a good night. Thank you. Ms. Ewan?
Unknown participant is now exiting.
Sorry about that. I don't have any questions at this point. Mrs. Rooks?
I just had one question on the previous slide. It said adding or creating multiple single occupancy restrooms. Is that based on the model that we just saw from Lake Pleasant Elementary, like that design? Or are
Yes
you
and no.
thinking of some other design? Okay.
We will start off with that design, but in my mind, I can picture restrooms in different parts of campuses and at different high schools. Some are square, some are rectangle, and rectangle in a way that they go forward. Some are rectangular, kind of like the cafeterias, and they're long. So depending on the location that site administration and their staff and students want to pick for their site, we will work within those parameters to see how much square footage we have, because we have to stay within that area, not go into classrooms, not go into hallway. And then we also, by city code, depending on the capacity of the building, there has to be a certain amount of fixtures for both male and female in the building. So we have to work through all those parameters. And that's why I did not include any potential designs, because right now, until we pick the one that the school would like, the architects get a hold of what is capable, what can we do in that space. We're not going to know those things. But we will start off trying to do something similar to Lake Pleasant, and then adjust if we have to.
Thank you for that.
And just to piggyback on that a little bit, I mean, I do appreciate the inclusivity, right, of all stakeholder voices in this decision-making, right? From our families, students, teachers, staff, for sure. I mean, our target audience are our students. It's important to hear their voice in this conversation. And certainly from a site perspective, those communities and every site's a little bit different, but including those voices as we make our decisions to make an adjustment that what I do appreciate accommodates, again, the shifting needs of our student population, but also accommodates a multitude of, concerns and thoughts that we've heard, over the past few months. In my mind, we just finished talking about academics. how our facilities are designed and how they create safe, supportive environments for our students do impact, their success in the classroom as well.
No, President Sandoval, I agree. And how the restrooms end up looking, some of the things that we want to address based off listening to student concerns from various groups is the vaping, the bullying. So if there's any way that we can make the traditional restrooms easier for staff to monitor what's happening without obstructing or crossing the line of privacy. So those are all things that we will take into consideration. For the District Administration Center, if you recall, in June, we had a community member attend a board meeting and brought up concerns in regards to ADA accessibility in this building. We have a draft version of an accessibility assessment, and we're trying to finalize that right now with recommended changes to this building, both outside in the parking lot, ramps, restrooms, in the boardroom. So we're looking through that and seeing what next steps are, but some basic things in the boardroom in regards to the podium. So you may see some changes in regards to seating capacity, if we have to add a second podium or replace this one. Place, kind of like in the movie theater, there are specific areas for wheelchairs to sit. So we'll have to clear spaces for that, which means that traditional seating will be affected. So we're going through all those, and once we have a plan for the different areas, we'll start implementing those. But one of the things that we need to look at in this building is also the restrooms, because of the ADA accessibility for the restrooms that are in the lobby. We've had 2 or 3 community members that have had difficulty because the building was built in 1989. It's compliant to that code from that year, but we can do better. And then finally, we still have ongoing operational needs. We're looking for a space, and we believe we have found one, to have centralized student records instead of the paper perm cards that are housed at schools in boxes and in different closets. Is centralizing those perm cards into one location that we can manage so we can ensure that we can continue to follow the Arizona State Library Archives guidelines. And then we're also looking for textbook and curriculum storage, especially with the new adoptions. We have science kits coming. We have a lot of materials that we just need. It wouldn't just be nice. We need a location to store them. And just like we've said for a few years, we have space. It's just usually the wrong type of space or it's in the wrong location. So we're working through those first 2. And then for other needs and consideration, not because I don't have enough on my plate, but we have challenges. And if we can't ignore them, we need to really look into them and come up with a plan, a holistic plan. So what administration is going to be doing is we're going to be forming a team, and these are just some of the items that team is going to be addressing. It's school consolidation, boundary changes that we have been putting off for a while, changes in enrollment patterns, new construction. I know that you'd heard that we're going to be building a building at Liberty High School. With the enrollment changes, new charter schools in the area, limited funding, we really need to look at a multi-year plan that takes all these things into consideration holistically, because if we act on one, it's going to have an impact on the others. And if we don't think that through, we could end up with something that doesn't benefit us in the long run. So that team, we're going to be looking at all these along with the needs of schools and programs. For example, what's in Old Main, the Met and PFA, they both need space to grow. And so we're looking at all these holistically, and we'll continue to bring updates back to the board, whether it's at the retreat or a February study session, most likely, where we're at, and then we'll keep you informed as we get more data. We're also working with Mr. Moss and Ms. Myers. We're going to go ahead and call for Applied Economics to start the study in preparation, just so that we have the updated data points, so we can have the correct data to make decisions.
So can I ask a question about the applied economics? Will you, because we're looking, I think, at more variables and more categories, so will there be more things included in that data than what was on the last one?
It'll probably be the same data, but we will work with Mr. Moss and Applied Economics to see if we can slice it in a different way for certain areas, so we can actually concentrate in the specific areas where we have these concerns that we know we need to address.
Well, I know that one of the things that has been said, and we've seen this growth in more students with, whether it's disabilities or higher need students, and that we, even with, when charter schools come in, we do tend to see that increase. And so as we're thinking about repurposing and that type of thing, just want to make sure that we still have the facilities that are going to support those students. For instance, like our bathrooms, I know going on to different campuses, sometimes we don't have the bathrooms that are suited to the needs of those particular students. So I don't know if the applied economics would be able to pull that data of our not only increasing enrollment, but will we have any data of what will that the enrollment needs be of the students to really help us to define what are our facilities going to need to provide?
I don't know if Applied Economics would have that data, but I believe Mr. Moss could, through Synergy, get us a good idea of what is there and what is needed as we make those shifts and recommendations. This time it's time for questions.
All right, further questions, comments? Mrs. Rooks?
Nope, none at this time, but thank you for the presentation.
Mrs. Ewing?
I'm pretty sure the answer to this is yes, but on the Lake Pleasant Elementary, the building with the new bathrooms, the single stalls, I just wanted to, I just wanted to make sure that, that those are the compliant with it, that will those be in that building, be compliant to the, or at least something in that building?
Mrs. Ewing, yes, those will be ADA accessible and compliant.
Mr. Molino, thank you for the presentation. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to consider moving forward. I mean, the updated demographer data, yes, we have another school being built in the northern sector of our district. And for me, competition's good, right? I think we keep our foot on the pedal and continue to innovate and stay relevant. And, I think you said it in your comment. It is important, that we do make very informed decisions. We have that information, at the surface level, but, there are other considerations that we need to take a look at to make sure that, we don't take our foot off the gas, right? And which could put us in an adverse situation moving forward. When I say take our foot off the gas, meaning still looking at the growth of the district and understanding where we need to, build facilities to continue to serve our students in the way that they deserve, right? So anyway, thank you for the data. Thank you for the information. Yeah, I'm looking forward to just hearing the continued updates. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Molino, would you like to advance slides for me? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Before we move on to the next presentation, does anybody need 5 minutes? I know we've gone through a lot. Is everybody good? Do you need 5 minutes? Do you want?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. All right, moving on to 3.3, Citizens Advisory Committee. Ms. Myers,
Yes,
welcome.
well, thank you. Good evening, President Sandoval, members of the Governing Board, Cabinet, and community. Thank you for the opportunity to provide information regarding citizens advisory committees that have formed in the past, as well as areas of focus for those committees possibly in the future. And so tonight I will highlight with this overview a handful of focus areas. I'll talk a little bit about policy related to citizens advisory committees and past committee structures and purpose. I'll also provide some background information regarding maintenance and override, maintenance and operations override considerations, bond funds and future capital needs that may relate to a future bond program, as well as we'll revisit the 2023 Citizens Advisory Committee's recommendations from last spring and the decision that the board made regarding a November election. We'll talk a little bit about bonding capacity and tax rates, and we'll also look at the next election date if there was to be consideration for a bond or an override election. And of course, you can ask questions along the way or at the end as well. And so moving on, we'll visit past committee purpose and related policies. And so there are several policies that are considered when the Citizens Advisory Committee makes recommendations to the governing board, also specifically related to bond elections. And I'll draw your attention to policy BDE, which is board committees, and policy BDF, advisory committees, which authorize the governing board to establish subcommittees, advisory committees, task forces, or ad hoc citizen study committees as necessary to address issues or topics determined by the governing board and the length of time that the committees will be in place. And per policy, the governing board has previously approved the purpose of the Citizens Advisory Committee, and we've also referred to it in the past as the Citizens Bond Advisory Committee, to make a recommendation to the governing board regarding calling for a bond election or an M&O override. And if the recommendation of the committee is that the district should go out for either a bond election or override election, the committee would also recommend subsequent dollar amounts or percentages associated with either recommendation. So when the governing board approves the Citizens Advisory Committee coming together, that group is technically a committee of the board, and so all of the meetings that take place are in public. They're subject to open meeting law, and then any recommendations that come forward from the committee ultimately have to have action from the governing board. The committee does not have the authority to make anything beyond a recommendation. The governing board ultimately considers that recommendation and either approves or does not approve next steps. And so moving on to the next slide, just to remind you, we'll time travel back over the last few years and recent committees that have come together. And so I'm highlighting 4 dates that the board took action and subsequently called for the reconvening of the Citizens Advisory Committee. Starting back in January of 2019, the governing board formally reconvened the Citizens Advisory Committee that I will now refer to as the 2019 Citizens Advisory Committee. And just to remind the governing board and community that that group during that time frame considered both a bond and an override. And the final outcome and recommendation from the committee to the governing board was to call for a 15% M&O override election. The next group that came together was in 2020, similar background, the board took action. The committee considered both a bond and an override, but in this instance, a renewal of our 13% override and a critical needs bond of $125,255,000. That also included land for a high school. Now, I'm in a few slides going to talk about the nuances of an override election and a bond, but we're just time traveling back, looking at action that the board has taken in recent years, coupled with the recommendations that came out of the committee. The 2 elections I just highlighted, the 15% override, which was an increase to our 13%, did not pass. In 2020, our override was renewed. The 13% was successful, but the bond question was not. And so now we look back most recently over the last two committees, and the next one took place in 2022 with the board bringing that group back on January 27th, 2022. And you'll note that every time that the committee is reconvened, there is consistency where a number of the members come back, and the board takes action to say we will reconvene the last committee. And if there are members who cannot continue, there's been direction to administration, the superintendent, to add replacement members to ensure there's a proper total, as well as to bring perspective to the committee's group. So there are a number of committee members who have served on more than one Citizens Advisory Committee. So back in January of 2022, the committee was reconvened. And at that point, because we had just renewed our 13% override, the focus was truly on a bond. And the outcome from that committee's work was there was a clear acknowledgement that a bond authorization is needed to support bond eligible projects. However, being on the heels of the pandemic and impacts with the economy during that period of time, the committee did not recommend to the governing board to call for an election. And so that then brings us to our most recent committee that was reconvened last November, November 10th, 2022, by the governing board to consider a bond, because again, we were still in the earlier stage of our 13% override that had been renewed. And so the committee met a total of 6 times and made the recommendation that the governing board should consider a $250 million authorization that included new construction for elementary schools as well as land for a new high school. So that's a quick summary looking back over the last 4 committees, and now I'll speak a little more in depth with some of the priority areas of focus, as well as revisiting the last committee's recommendation and some of the priorities that they highlighted with that work. So moving on to the next slide. Thank you. I'll talk a little bit about maintenance and operations overrides. And on October 26th, I did provide the annual bond program and M&O override presentation to the governing board. So some of the information I'm going to share, we did just present at the last board meeting, but I'll highlight some of the main considerations. I always like to start with the definition. Maintenance and operations are where the majority of the district's daily and annual activities take place. It's salaries and benefits, utilities, fuel, transportation costs, supplies, as well as special education costs. So basically, it's positions and programs, and it is expenditures that are not of a capital nature. You cannot build a new school with M&O funds. You can't buy a new school bus with maintenance and operations. It's truly positions, programs, and people. And so each year we receive our maintenance and operations funding based in part on a equalization formula, a base support level that's driven by our enrollment, and every school district has that same funding level from the state. And in statute, districts are permitted to, with voter approval, increase their M&O budget. And there's a revenue control limit, a formula that we include in our budget each year. And with voter authorization, a district can consider asking for a 10% increase or a 13%, 15%. I highlighted we did make an attempt to have a 15% override a few years ago. I will say the majority of our peer districts have a 15% override. I am going to make that notation. We have a 13% that we most recently renewed in 2020. And the highlight with that is once an override's in place, it's in place for 7 years. And if it's not renewed by the end of year 5, in year 6, that additional funding starts to sunset by 1/3 and then by 2/3 the following year. So that's why looking at the history, when we moved from a 10% override to a 13% override with voter approval back in November of 2015, we needed to go out and at a minimum renew that 13% override, which we did in 2020. So with that, going on to the next slide, and this is information we presented at the last governing board meeting, the 13% override provides around $32 million of additional funding each year that would not normally be included in our annual budget from the state of Arizona. And again, it is positions, people, and programs. It supports having assistant principals at our schools, as well as extracurricular activities, athletics, band, choir, and art, reading and gifted programs, nurses and healthcare professionals at our schools, PE. It helps us maintain our class size. It also helps us from a competition, retention, and recruiting perspective, because every single employee has a portion of their salary in the M&O override. And it also allows us to provide all-day kindergarten to our community at no cost. The state, as I shared on the 26th, provides funding for a half day, and we support a full day with the M&O override. So you can see that we're starting to approach a timeline where if it's not renewed by year 5, you start losing that additional funding in year 6, and then it's phased out in year 7, fully eliminated by year 8. So again, $32 million of our budget is currently supported by the 13% override. Now we'll talk a little bit about bond authorizations. I mentioned capital purchases, projects that are similar to new construction, comprehensive renovations and maintenance projects, as well as land acquisition, as an example, campus remodels, new roofs, HVAC, parking lot, plumbing. All of those expenses are capital eligible, but again, there's a certain funding level from the state each year. And historically, public school districts have looked to their communities to pass a bond authorization to support the district in managing some of those very expensive capital projects, including new construction. And so state statute allows a district to, through a bond election, ask their voters to approve a certain dollar amount and authorization. I've shared previously our most recent bond was approved in 2012. It was a $180 million authorization. That authorization allows a public school district to sell bonds annually. And those bond sales are then used or are purchased by investors, and they are used to fund comprehensive projects, new school construction, the purchase of transportation vehicles, buses, technology as well. And then those bonds are paid back over time, and they're tax-exempt bonds. And so our most recent bond authorization has concluded. I shared on the 26th that we finalized expending those proceeds. The last bond sale took place in 2019, and at this point, Peoria Unified does not have an active bond program. Mr. Molino highlighted briefly in his presentation some of the needs that were identified back in 2020 and initially presented to our Citizens Advisory Committee at that point in time with a facility assessment and utilization study. And again, these are 2020 figures, but a 15-year planning horizon was evaluated and then pared back to 5-year increments. And as you can see, there are ongoing needs to not only build a new school when appropriate, but to ensure safety, priority, and critical projects are addressed, as well as to do preventative maintenance so you don't have more expensive projects down the road, and that's part of a facilities master plan. And so we've shared these dollar amounts in the past, and of course, if we were to index them today with inflation, they would be higher. Next slide, please. And back when we went out for the last bond in 2020, there was a focus on priority and essential projects, and I've highlighted those include roofing, HVAC, fire and life safety, as an example. Those are always a consideration and first in line when we look at spending capital dollars, and so we'll move on. And again, it's not just facilities. Comprehensive technology infrastructure, laptops, for both staff and students. Technology has a useful life. It needs to be refreshed periodically. Buses, all of those assets are depreciated over time, and they have a set useful life. And again, a bond authorization helps school districts to make those purchases to make sure they're planning accordingly year over year. And then, of course, high school land, elementary school construction, because we typically receive donations of land for elementary schools, but high school land parcels need to be purchased. And then the cost of new high school construction as well. So those are considerations when the Citizens Advisory Committee comes together to look at a bond authorization. Moving on, district needs are also balanced with our current environment. We talked a little bit about applied economics and demographics, enrollment changes, the aging out of some of our populations in the southern portion of the district, as well as the growth that's occurring in the northern part. So demographics, enrollment projections, economic factors. I shared a little bit a couple of years ago, the economy and concerns with inflation was a driving consideration for our Citizens Advisory Committee. Campus utilization and capacity are also discussion points. But in addition, the tax rate. Maintaining a stable or declining tax rate is so important, as well as assessed valuation of values of property, be it residential, commercial, or agricultural property in the district, all come into the formula of looking at what a bond authorization should look like and what would be considered by voters in the district. And so moving to the next slide, I'll just summarize. When the Citizens Advisory Committee met last spring, they had a total of 6 meetings, and we went in depth looking at the considerations I just highlighted from a demographic perspective, tax rates, current needs related to facility maintenance, and what we can do with our current funding, also aggressively pursuing school facilities board renewal grants. That's something we do regularly. But in a nutshell, here's a summary of some of the priority focuses. Mr. Molino talked a little bit about restrooms, but we've shared this information before. In fact, this presentation slide was originally presented on May 11th, 2023 to the governing board. This is available on board docs. But in a nutshell, these were the main areas that were reviewed. And then we looked at, with the committee, what do we have from a local funding perspective, with not only capital funds that we have, but what we're expecting over the next several years, as well as projected grant funding that we would receive from the School Facilities Board, as well as any fund balance opportunities we would have from our net position in our capital funds, and what that would look like to meet all of those needs from a total bond authorization perspective. So moving on to the next slide. Taking into consideration all of that information, our Citizens Advisory Committee did make a recommendation that the district should consider a bond election in November 2023 with a request for a $250 million bond authorization. That authorization would include new elementary school construction, as well as funding to purchase a parcel of land for the next high school. Now, I will remind the governing board that as the committee met, we did learn that there was no longer a set-aside parcel for Peoria Unified School District for a high school. So any future parcel purchase would have to be acquired either from the state of Arizona or another private seller. There was not a parcel available for us to actively go and purchase, but the committee felt it was important to have funding when that opportunity arose. So that was the recommendation that took place. And then on the next slide, subsequently, I'll highlight the outcomes from that recommendation. You'll recall on May 11th, the governing board did consider the recommendation, and at that point had directed administration to work with our professional advisors, legal counsel, to bring forward a resolution for consideration and approval for a November 2023 election. But subsequently, the decision was made after looking at all factors and opportunities that it wasn't the right time. So even though the committee made the recommendation that a bond authorization should be considered, ultimately the district, the governing board, did not make the recommendation to move forward. And so that brings us now to today as we look back to see what work took place last year to look at next steps. So moving on to the next slide, I will highlight just some additional data points for your consideration, having reflected on over the last 2 Citizens Advisory Committees and their work. There was definitely a conclusion or a recommendation related to next steps for a bond. So there was consensus that a bond authorization was something that should be considered by the district as something that's important to fund projects that normally would not be supported with annual capital funding from the state of Arizona. So I just want to make that distinction. But there are also other considerations, tax rate. And so I shared this slide back on October 26th, and I'll remind the governing board and the group here tonight that first off, with the primary tax rate, that's that set base level, that support from the state of Arizona, that is the same funding formula for every student, that is based on enrollment, in part district by district. So even if we didn't have a bond or an override, there'd still be that primary tax rate per se. But where voter-approved initiatives come into play, it's the secondary tax rate, and we've presented over time that the 13% M&O override, as well as our outstanding bond sales in combination, have been declining in recent years. And so we've looked at this each time that we set our budget. When we provide our October update, it has been very important to the district to manage a staple tax rate, but because we've not had a new bond authorization in recent years, we're actually seeing a more distinct decline. The M&O is typically stable because we renewed the same percentage, a 13% override, but the bond sales are being amortized, and over time, you're going to see that portion of the tax rate decrease. And so again, the district's tax rate, it is calculated annually, and it's based on the tax levy for the district and assessed values that are calculated by the county assessor. And again, we could never eliminate property taxes per se because of that primary tax rate, but the voter-approved initiatives impact the secondary tax rate. And so once again, on the 26th, I did highlight that we've seen a decrease from $2.2311, to be exact, $2.2311 per $100 of limited assessed valuation in fiscal year 23 to $2.1269 in 2024. And so now we'll move on to the next slide. And this also provides a nice visual graphic, the bar chart looking back over both the last 5 years and 10 years with our average tax rate. And basically over the last 5 years, the tax rate has decreased 4.7%, I should say. And over the last 10 years, that's an average of 3%. So it's not just that smaller snapshot that I shared, but it's something that has been trending for the last 10 years. And now moving to the next slide, this data set was shared with the Citizens Advisory Committee as well as the governing board. And I will be updating some of the information on the following slide, but it's a good at a glance. And what I mean by that is we did previously share that the district's outstanding bond debt related to past bond sales is currently $153 million, with a tax rate that has continued to decrease as we amortize those outstanding bond sales. And we also noted previously, and I'll bring it to your attention again, that the district's credit rating is AA negative from S&P or Standard & Poor, which is considered a high quality rating. So that's something that we're proud of here in Peoria Unified. I am going to note that our limited assessed value and full cash assessed value on this slide actually has been updated, and technically our bonding capacity at this point is higher than the $560 million that's listed, but it's a slide we've provided before, and I wanted to bring it back as a point of reference. And so with that, moving to the next slide, you'll see that over time, assessed values in the district have been increasing. And that is something that we track in part because the district's net full cash assessed valuation has increased over the last 10 years and is now in excess of $4 billion. And the net full cash assessed valuation is part of the district's legal debt limit. And that limit is basically the ceiling for any bond authorizations that we can have in place from our community that we can't exceed to sell bonds that are capped at that top rate. And so the way we calculate our legal debt limit is the greater of either 20% of the net full cash assessed valuation or $1,500 per student ADM. And so, of course, the 20% of the net full cash assessed valuation is what applies to Peoria Unified, because that's the greater of the two. And again, when we looked at this back in the spring, our bonding capacity at that point in time was $560 million. And then if we move to the next slide, bonding capacity over time is impacted by the amortization of outstanding bond sales. So if we look to the far left of this graph, you'll see where we were in 2023, and then that 2024 demarc of around $560 million. And then over time, as we pay off outstanding sales, there's an inverse relationship where that bonding capacity continues to increase. And so with that, bond elections and override elections can only take place in November. They can't take place in May or a special election. So Tuesday, November 5th, 2024 would be the next opportunity for the Peoria Unified School District to ask our community to consider a bond authorization and or to go out 1 year early before that critical year 5, like we had in 2020 for our 13% override. So 2024 would be 1 year early. November of 2025 is when we need to renew our 13% override. And with that, I will conclude the presentation, and administration is available to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Myers, as always. Questions, comments, Ms. Ewing? Mrs. Rooks?
Nope, I have no questions, but thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, I know, as always, it's very, very complete. But I know the district continues to problem solve with the resources that it has. I do appreciate that, and certainly the in-depth conversation around academics and those, as we implement other programs and resources, those always come with a dollar sign, the majority of the time attached to them. So anyway, no, thank you for the information. A lot to really kind of absorb and take in and to determine, how we move forward as it relates to a bond and override and what makes sense for the district and our students, teachers, and staff. So thank you for that. Mr. Molino, anything else?
No, sir.
Ms. Fesley? Ms. Ari? No. Dr. Annette? Ms. Myers, thank you again. Ms. Donner, anything from you? You good? In a study session, it's open. Board members, any other questions, comments? All good? All right. With that said, since we don't have our laptop, I'm going to have Ms. Donner run us through a voice vote. I do need a motion to adjourn this study session at 6:51 p.m.
I'll motion we adjourn at 6:51 p.m.
I will second.
Ms. Donner, we have a motion made by Mrs. Rooks and a second by Mrs. Ewing. If you can run us through a voice vote, that'd be great.
President Sandoval,
Yes.
Yes.
aye. Mrs. Ewing.
Looks like motion passes. 3 yeas and 1 absent. Thank you, board members. Thank you, community. Thank you, cabinet, Mr. Molino, for your time. A lot of really, really good information. Appreciate it. All right, have a good evening.